And obviously the one thing, again, that you've got involved with or pursued since you've been there is your scavenger art. Do you want to explain why I mean, obviously, in terms of your kind of literary work, your criticism, your academic work, I mean, voracious appetite for all those things and brilliant work as well. But I mean, to get involved in something that's very, malleable, very kind of textile, very feeling. I mean, how's that been as a journey for you?
Well, I mean, I guess it's going backwards, because I think that the art kind of, as I understood it, started happening to me. I wasn't really conscious of becoming an artist as such. And when I looked back at the works I had made after 2 years of doing it, if you had showed me them 2 years before, I wouldn't have recognized them as something I was ever going to make or even want to make. I would have been kind of shocked by them, or, surprised by them myself, which is why I knew they were authentic. It's because they happened in a way that was beyond me in terms of the kind of more intentional work that I do in the scholarly realm. But then I noticed, Madonnas creeping in there, apples were popping up, nails were hugely important. So it didn't take long to realize. And I was working in the triptych form, of course, which is the great form of like religious art. I was making a lot of triptychs. So I realized that there was a whole grammar of possibility in Catholic art that I had recovered and was now repurposing to an aesthetic project beyond Catholicism, but always informed by it. And in many ways, of course, in a profound conversation with it.
And then for the uninformed, scavenger art is literally just that. It's what you're finding formerly live creatures which are now not.
Yes.
So what kind of, again, I've seen some pictures of your work. I mean, it goes from big to small and small to big. I mean, what kind of thing are you working with?
What happened was I used to walk the beach religiously, shall we say, and I started finding things that I couldn't leave behind, and they would come home. And then I realized I had a pile of bones, and I had a pile of metal, and I had a pile of wood and feathers and some shells. And there were only about 5 materials that I used. I started carrying home clams and mussels and realized you couldn't really use them. So not everything was of use, it seemed. And then all of a sudden it refined itself down, and I realized what I was collecting was anything that had been alive or worked on, had been thrown into the sea, had been vomited back up onto the beach, and kind of just, smoothed over by the ocean, or worried a little bit by the ocean, by la mer, and just bringing it home. And then bird carcasses. And then I started I bought a toboggan for seals, and I was burying seals in my garden to incubate them. And I realized I was into some more serious matter there. Now I have people bringing me roadkill. People just stop by with a porcupine and drop it on this. So it's the recomposition of decomposition is the glib way of saying it. But I find something very poignant about struggle. And when you see an animal that was so beautifully alive and is now just kind of inert and lying there, there's something undignified about that. And I try to bring it home and give them a second shot at dignity by making them into something more kind of peaceful looking or resolved or aesthetically beautiful. So it has a kind of a redemptive fantasy built in. But it's also a form of grief work for me in relation to my own parents. I have work about my father. I have work about my mother. So it's been really helpful when there's certain things you don't know how to talk about and maybe don't feel you want to talk about anymore, or it's all been said, but it's still with you. It's quite a nice way to meditate on that through matter. And there's something, as you say, affective and touchy-feely, and it doesn't end run around the ego and that kind of defense. So you will go to places that are quite surprising and pleasing when you get there. And sometimes you look at things and go, what have I just made, I mean, I have one called Mother, and it's not a portrait in any meaningful way of my mother, I would hope. But it does reflect on motherhood in Ireland as well in the Catholic tradition. So it comes back to the work I've been doing on the maternal body in the culture in which I was raised, shall we say.
About this, I want to imagine the future that you're thinking about, in which you say that ritual is going to somehow or other allow us to move forward. And I'm just worried that it's sometimes said about Catholicism that in the 18th century, that it was, above all things, that it was ritualistic, that Irish Catholicism was pietistic and it was performative. And ritual took such a central part in Irish Catholicism that they maybe the spirituality beneath it actually was lost. I just wonder, perhaps babies and bathwater things, if in the future, what will be different about the ritual that you're going to, or that one hopes will replace what was lost? How will that actually be profound and not simply performative and bring us down the same pointless road?
That's a great question, Joe. What's remarkable about Irish Catholicism in this regard is how anti-intellectual it was when Catholicism was such an astonishing intellectual tradition.
Right.
And when, you know, like I went through Catholic school and I sat through a lot of bullshit, as you know. I mean, you're sitting there with your eyes bulging, waiting for some interesting thing to come out of their mouth, and it just wasn't happening. They could have just read us Aquinas, you know, or Augustine. They could have, if you just read us from the theologians, we might have learned something interesting. Like, so there was an utter disconnect between the intellectual tradition and the social ritual. Now, in psychoanalytic terms, what happens there, as you know, is there's a kind of split. And so that the rituals aren't being informed by, they're not being fed by any connection to the liturgy or the theology. So they can't enact, they can't consecrate and reconsecrate the liturgy, and they can't actually tell us anything about the state of our souls. They're empty, rote, repetitive, as you say, and that's what happens. So that the new rituals would have to be very keenly articulated to a set of like precepts or commandments about what an Ireland beyond shame would be trying to do. So grief choirs would have to have an object of mourning. Who are we mourning? And you just move through a liturgy for a person-specific, in a person-specific site like Renard, or you can go to Tuam. You can go wherever you think Irish shame hovers in the air and mist. And we all have our sites, and they don't have to be public. They can be private as well. In other words, they can be your own personal collective mourning. So that would be the thing, Joe, would be not to reproduce the disconnect